For most of the last century, historians have written history books as if the natural world simply did not matter. Plants, animals, soil, water, climate, weather, these were largely irrelevant to the history profession itself. Let me give you an example of what I mean. This is actually the textbook that I read as a high school student. I had to go into my attic to find it. I was actually debriefed after this. It was published in 1977. This book is a standard political history in which we learned about the various achievements of political figures like George Washington, Jefferson, FDR, and so on, and it's actually a pretty good book. The natural world, however, did not seem to figure at all in the story. It existed as a kind of backdrop to the past. You can learn in this book, for example, about the Industrial Revolution, but you won't find out anything about the important role played by rivers and water in producing energy for this process. You can learn in this book about the suburbs, suburbanization, Levittown, that kind of thing, but you won't find out anything in the book about the vast transformation of the landscape into turf grass and lawns that happened in the post-World War II period. And just as an aside, the last time I checked, lawns were a $40 billion a year industry here in the US. In short, nature did not enter in any meaningful way into the story being told here of the American past. Well, a few years after I read this book, I read this one. And this book changed how I thought about history. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that it changed my life. The book is Donald Worcester's Dustbowl. It was published in 1979, and it examines the Depression-era dust storms that blew across the country during the so-called Dirty 30s. Nature, Donald Worcester argued, needed to be moved from the background to the foreground of the story that historians told. Natural forces, in this case, soil and drought, had shaped the American past, he reasoned, just as much as the political figures that I had read about in the Great Republic. Long story short, I'd go on to study under Donald Worcester and then spend the next 30 years of my life looking at the ways in which history has been shaped by the constraints imposed by the natural world, and also, of course, the ways in which humankind has controlled and dominated and transformed the physical environment itself. So today, what I'd like to try to do with you is offer you an example of what I'm talking about here. I'd like to see if I can change how you think about America's largest city by taking a kind of ground-up view of the city of New York and drawing on my book, Gotham Unbound, The Ecological History of Greater New York. You won't be surprised to learn that there are thousands and thousands of books and articles about the city of New York. But nearly all of these studies treat the city as if the land mass itself is a settled question. In fact, the Big Apple has gotten bigger over the years, much bigger. Across New York Harbor as a whole, an estimated 150 square miles of wetland and open water have been filled in since the early part of the 19th century. That's an area, 150 square miles, about 7 times the size of the entire island of Manhattan. Building in the floodplain, indeed in the water, has been second nature in New York, and the question for the historian is, what's up with that? How did this come about? Well, it turns out that New York has been thumbing its nose at the sea for some 300 years. The Dutch, it is true, built a canal down what is today Broad Street in lower Manhattan. But it was actually the English in the latter part of the 1600s who laid the groundwork for New York's expansion at the expense of the surrounding waters. In 1686, the governor of New York, Thomas Dongan, on behalf of the Crown, granted the city of New York title to land underwater to the low water mark around the southern part of the island. Then, 45 years later, in 1731, then Governor John Montgomery went a step further and granted the city title to land underwater 400 feet beyond the low water mark around the southern part of the island. The English, in other words, created a market in underwater land. And then the city turned around and started to dole out these so-called water lots to the merchant elite, various well-off artisans and others, and expand the size of the island. They filled it in with everything you can think of: abandoned, sunken ships, rocks, detritus, garbage, you name it. Well, it's probably not a coincidence that a few years after the Montgomery Charter, this map here that you see, Bradford's map of New York Harbor, 1735, was published. This is the first map we have of New York Harbor as a whole. The map was sold bundled with a copy of the Montgomery Charter. New York, you might say, New York Harbor, you might say, was then born alongside this idea of expansion into the sea. So what's happening here? Well, you're basically taking a sliver of land, which is what Manhattan Island looked like, and you're bulking it up into the bulbous southern part of Manhattan that you probably know today, and you're thereby creating more lineal feet of waterfront, which was, of course, the city's premier resource in a city that was, of course, hitching its hopes to maritime commerce. And also, by bringing the island out into deeper water, it made it easier for ships to tie up. Which is to say that it is not an accident that Manhattan today is some 1,700 football fields larger than it was when Henry Hudson came sailing into New York Harbor in 1609. And you can see some of the filling in here that's gone on in the lower part of the island there in this graphic. The creation of local markets in land is a common theme in early American history. But in New York, the colonists went a step further and showed that land wasn't even a fixed resource, that they could make more of it. Unheard of to this point in North America. The seeds, in other words, of New York's expansion at the expense of the sea had been planted. Okay, so we're going to move quickly now. New York succeeded as a port, spurred on by the building of the Erie Canal. Its manufacturing took off, and as you know, it evolved into the financial center of the world. Meanwhile, the population passed the 1 million mark in the 1870s. All of this very, very well known. Less well known is that an 1821 hurricane tracked straight through Newark, New Jersey, and placed the city of New York on the dangerous right side of the storm because of the counterclockwise rotation of these kinds of systems. This created an estimated storm surge at the Battery in lower Manhattan of 10 to 11 feet. A storm surge is a wind-driven gush of land over the water. Very dangerous. The 1821 storm destroyed wharves. It flooded Manhattan as far north as Canal Street, where you can buy cheap pocketbooks today, they tell me, that kind of thing. At the time, New York was America's largest city, but actually it was relative to where it would end up. It was pretty small, which is to say there were only 125,000 people there then. If the 1821 hurricane had come 50 years later, the destruction would have been monumental, and I dare say the question of coastal flooding would be much more at the forefront of the city's collective consciousness. But instead, something remarkable happened. New York entered into a very quiet period storm-wise, and that's why I brought this graphic with me here today. As you can see with that red line there are no storms, major storms to speak of, between 1821 and 1888. 1888 is the Great Blizzard. It's written about in just about every New York history book I've ever read. Nothing about the 1821 hurricane, however. Okay. Well, there were two very important topographic changes that happened during this period of storm quiescence, and I want to talk to you about them here for a minute. The first topographic change of note is this: staggering economic growth in the second quarter of the 19th century, underwritten by the Erie Canal and rarely mentioned, the discovery of a new, deeper channel into New York Harbor in 1835, of course, increased the city's port prospects, and it caused development in New York to spread beyond the floodplain of southern Manhattan in the 1840s out to Brooklyn, the southernmost circle there, at Red Hook and Gowanus in the 1840s and after. And then development also spread during this period of storm quiescence across the way to New Jersey, to Bergen Neck, where islands backed by marsh and fronted by oyster reefs became the cities of Jersey City and Hoboken. That was the first topographic change. The second topographic change that happened during this period of calm was an improvement in navigation that happened by removing the rocks at a tumultuous stretch of water called Hell Gate. This is where the East River meets Long Island Sound, and it's called Hell Gate, obviously, because it was hell for navigators to get through here. So to improve that and domesticate the waters, if you will, the engineers removed the rocks there and widened the connection, thereby increasing the potential for high storm tides. Together, these two changes increased the city's overall risk and vulnerability to coastal flooding. Well, countering this vulnerability were Greater New York's immense tidal wetlands, shown here in green. And this is how the area of Greater New York looked roughly around 1900 or so. So not that long ago. This was about when my grandparents were born. There were, according to a document, a study in 1904 that I think is quite credible, in 1904, there were some 300 square miles of wetland within a 25-mile radius of City Hall in Manhattan. And 300 square miles of wetlands, that's equivalent, put it all together, to the entire city of New York, all 5 boroughs. These wetlands were teeming with plant and animal life, grasses, osprey, and so on. Wetlands are some of the most biologically productive landscapes on the face of the earth. They provide nursery grounds for juvenile fish, they filter pollutants and sediment from the water, and most important for my topic here today, they acted like a giant sponge to lessen the impact of flooding and also the likelihood of storm surge. What I'm saying is, New York was a big city located in a swamp. This is in the early part of the 20th century. But over the next 80 years, the wetlands were reduced to a mere shadow of their former selves, declining by about 80%, destroyed to make way for real estate, roads, parks, landfills, airports, the New York, in other words, that we know today. Consider what happened at Jamaica Bay. In 1900, there were 25 square miles of marshland in Jamaica Bay. The bay was one of the largest sources of oysters in New York State. Sears and Roebuck used to send buyers there to purchase pelts, muskrat pelts from trappers. This was all in the early part of the 20th century. But then things began to change in the 1930s when the main channel into the bay was deepened, eliminating several marsh islands. In 1931, Barren Island, on the western edge of the bay, was joined to mainland Brooklyn to create New York's first municipal airport, Floyd Bennett Field. 10 years later, the city targeted the eastern side of the bay to create Kennedy Airport, and again, more marshland succumbed. Meanwhile, New Deal funding for local highway projects opened the way for Robert Moses, New York's master builder, and his engineers to build the Bell Parkway on the north shore of Jamaica Bay. Moses, it turned out, who sometimes seemed to have very little patience for the irregularities of the natural world. He once called a wetland off of Randall's Island a geological slopover. Moses would make his reputation with major land-making projects that produce streamlined versions of the natural world. Think of Jones Beach or something like that. But here at Jamaica Bay, he wanted drivers to experience clean, open views of the water off the coast as they drove by. Well, the construction of the Bell Parkway precipitated significant landscape change in pursuit of this end, especially along the north shore of the bay, where creeks and marshes had to be filled in order to create a solid foundation for the road. If you're on the Bell Parkway today, you're going to be in traffic. You'll have plenty of time to observe these signs that say Spring Creek, this brook, and so, and that's about all that's left of them. So to follow this out, by 2010, there are only a bit over 3 square miles of marshland left. We went from 25 square miles in 1900 to 3 square miles in 2010. Well, as New York expanded into the surrounding waters and its wetlands vanished, coastal flooding emerged as a serious problem for the city in the post-war period. And very little, in fact, almost nothing was done to address this problem, which is to say that the capital of capitalism is not doing all that well in the flood protection department. And that's why I brought this slide with me today. London has 10 times the protection of New York from coastal flooding. Amsterdam and Rotterdam have 100 times the protection of New York from coastal flooding. London and Rotterdam have storm surge barriers in place. Tokyo has the largest storm water retention tank in the world, as well as a series of elaborate floodgates. All of this built in response to typhoons in the 1950s. Why wasn't this done in New York? Well, it wasn't that such a plan wasn't considered. In the 1960s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers responded to New York's coastal flood problem with a plan to build a giant barrier from New Jersey all the way to Queens and another up at Throgs Neck, but it was never built, likely because of the scale of the project. The lower barrier would have been 7 miles long. The Thames barrier is a mere, it's about 1/3 of a mile or so. The city was thus a sitting duck when Hurricane Sandy blew through in 2012. Sandy, which was no longer a hurricane at landfall in New Jersey, it was a post-tropical cyclone. Sandy nevertheless produced a storm surge at the battery of 9.4 feet, below the estimated 10 to 11 I told you about in the 1821 storm. 17% of New York City was flooded in the storm, and nearly 90,000 buildings experienced damage of one kind or another. Most of the storm's victims were either public housing residents or low to moderate income homeowners. Over half the people killed on Staten Island were standing on land that had formerly been marsh. Well, recognizing the obvious risks here, New York's emergency managers in 2013 produced a new hurricane evacuation map for the city of New York, which you see right here. 2.9 million New Yorkers, so nearly 3 million New Yorkers, live in these 6 hurricane evacuation zones. The land area in total of the 6 evacuation zones equals 147 square miles, which is half the size of the city of New York. To put a fine point on this, New York's emergency managers are arguing that half of New York land area is in need of evacuation in the event of a hurricane. Okay, now for the bad news. Climate change. The mid-range prediction is that sea level around New York is going to rise. This is the one that's most likely to happen, is going to rise 11 to 21 inches by the 2050s. Okay, and that's the orange there. To put the 11 to 21 inch figure in perspective for you, between the 1850s and the present, sea level around New York rose by about 1.5 feet. So now you are talking about an even greater rise in sea level in a mere 35 years. Storms traveling over higher water are, of course, infinitely more damaging. I don't think you have to have majored in analytical philosophy in college to recognize that there is a problem here. What's the moral of my story? Think twice before you drain a swamp.